Have you ever wondered what it would take for someone who had spent years believing one thing about Jesus to suddenly begin asking questions they could no longer ignore? What if a single night, one unexplained encounter, and one moment that seemed impossible could completely change the direction of an entire family? Stay with us until the very end, because today's testimony begins with a moment that no one expected, and what happened afterward left a family facing questions they had spent years avoiding. There is a reason this story has remained unforgettable, and by the time you hear what happened at the end, you may understand why one simple experience became the beginning of a much deeper journey toward faith. Welcome to Found by Grace. If this is your first time here, we are truly grateful to have you with us. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us where you are watching from, your country, your city, and your local time. And if you're carrying a burden today, whether it is a financial struggle, a family problem, fear, loneliness, or something you have been praying about privately, you can share it in the comments so we can remember you in prayer. You may feel like nobody sees what you are going through, but your story matters, and there is hope even in seasons when the answer seems far away. Now listen carefully, because this testimony is not simply about something mysterious that happened one night. It is about a young life, a family facing difficult questions, and a journey that would challenge everything they thought they understood. As you listen, pay attention to the small details, because something that happens early in the story will only make sense much later. And when you finally discover what that moment led to, you may find yourself asking a deeper question. What would you do if God used an unexpected moment to make you stop, listen, and search for Him? Stay with us, keep your heart open. Now here is the testimony. My name is Yusuf Demir. I was 12 years old when this happened, and I lived with my father, Imam Harun Demir, my mother Aylan, and my younger sister Elif in a quiet neighborhood not far from the old streets of Konya. My father had served as an imam for many years. People respected him, visited our home for advice, and often asked him to pray for their families. To everyone around us, our family looked peaceful. But inside our home, there was one problem that had followed me for as long as I could remember. My right ear could not hear. My mother told me that when I was very young, doctors had tried to understand why. I remembered hospital rooms, bright lights, strange machines, and my mother holding my hand while someone examined my ear. I did not understand the medical words they used, but I understood the result. My right ear remained silent. At school, I always tried to sit where I could hear the teacher clearly. When my classmates called me from my right side, I often did not respond because I simply did not know they were calling. Some children made jokes about it, and although I pretended not to care, their words stayed inside me. Sometimes I wondered why God had allowed me to grow up with something that made me different from other children. I never told my father how deeply it hurt because I knew he already carried enough worries. One evening, several weeks before that strange night, I came home from school angry and tired. I threw my school bag beside the door and sat quietly at the table. My father noticed immediately. He was preparing for the evening prayer, but he stopped and looked at me. He asked what had happened, and I told him that some boys had laughed because I did not hear them when they spoke to me. My father became silent. He sat beside me and placed his hand gently on my shoulder. He reminded me that my worth was not decided by what my body could or could not do. Then he told me something that I did not understand at the time. He said that sometimes the hardest seasons in a person's life can become the very places where their faith is tested most deeply. I nodded, but inside I was still angry. I wanted a normal life. I wanted to hear someone whispering on my right side. I wanted to sit in a crowded room without constantly turning my head. More than anything, I wanted to know whether God actually heard the prayers my family had been making for me. That night, my father prayed longer than usual. I watched him from the doorway, and for the first time I noticed how tired he looked. When he finished, he did not immediately leave the prayer room. He remained there with his head bowed. I quietly walked away, but something about his expression stayed in my mind. Later, while everyone was asleep, I woke because I thought I heard someone moving through the house. At first I ignored it. Then I heard a soft sound again. I sat up in bed and looked toward the door. My heart began beating faster. I could not tell whether the sound had come from inside the room or from the hallway. I reached for the lamp, but before I could turn it on, I noticed a faint glow beneath the bedroom door. I knew my parents were asleep. I knew the hallway light was off. And yet there was something outside my room that seemed to be shining. I slowly stood up, opened the door, and stepped into the darkness. What I saw at the end of that hallway was the beginning of the moment I would remember for the rest of my life. Before I could call my father, the brightness became stronger, and I felt a strange peace mixed with fear. I could not move. I could not understand whether I was dreaming or awake. Then, in that moment, I became aware of a presence standing ahead of me. I believed it was an angel, although I did not understand why I was seeing such a thing. I could not make out every detail clearly because the light around the figure was so bright, but I remember seeing a person standing calmly where the hallway should have been empty. I remember feeling as if my whole body had become still. Then something happened that made me touch my right ear. For the first time in my life, I could hear something from that side. It was not loud. It was faint at first, almost like a distant sound carried by the wind. I pressed my hand against my ear and stared ahead in disbelief. Then I heard another sound, clearer than the first. My eyes filled with tears. I wanted to run to my parents, but my legs would not move. And just when I thought the strange moment could not become more mysterious, the figure seemed to reveal something to me about my father, something I had never told anyone before. That was the moment I realized this was not simply about my ear. Something much bigger was about to happen in my family, and by morning, my father would have to face a question that would shake everything he believed he understood about my experience. I stood frozen in that hallway, staring into the brightness, while my right hand remained pressed against my ear. I could hear something that I had never heard clearly before, and the discovery frightened me more than the darkness did. The figure before me seemed peaceful, and although I cannot explain exactly what I saw, I believed I was looking at an angel. I did not hear a normal human voice, yet I felt as though a message was being placed in my heart. The figure revealed to me that my father had been carrying a private burden for a long time, and that he had been praying about something he had never told me. I immediately thought of the nights when I had seen my father sitting alone, after everyone else had gone to sleep. I remembered the tired look on his face and the way he sometimes remained silent when my mother asked him what was wrong. Then the brightness began to fade. I reached toward it, but my hand touched nothing. The hallway became dark again, and suddenly I heard my little sister breathing in the room beside mine. I ran toward my parents' bedroom, calling for my father, but I stopped at the door because I heard him praying. I could hear every word through my left ear, but something was different. I could also hear the faint movement of the house on my right side. I covered my mouth because I was afraid that if I made a sound, the experience would disappear. Then I whispered my father's name, and he immediately opened the door. My father looked at me and asked why I was awake. I told him that something had happened to my ear, but I did not tell him everything about the figure because I was afraid he would think I had imagined it. He switched on the light and examined me carefully. He asked me to cover my left ear, then he stood on my right side and quietly called my name. I heard him. His face changed instantly. He tried again from farther away, and once more I heard him. My mother woke up and came into the room, confused by what was happening. When she realized that I was responding to sounds from my right side, she began crying. My father did not celebrate immediately. Instead, he looked deeply concerned. He asked me exactly what I had seen in the hallway. I hesitated, then finally told him about the brightness and the figure. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat down on the edge of the bed and lowered his head. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then my father admitted something I had never known. For months, he had been struggling with a private question about his faith and his responsibility as a father. He had prayed repeatedly for guidance, but he had never told me because he did not want to place his burden on a 12-year-old child. He did not tell me that the experience proved anything, and he warned me not to become proud or frightened because of what I had seen. Instead, he told me that we needed to be careful, pray, and seek proper medical advice about my hearing. His response surprised me. I had expected him to become excited, but instead he became more serious than I had ever seen him. The following morning, my mother took me to a hearing specialist in Konya. I sat inside the examination room while the doctor performed several tests, and for the first time I understood how serious my family considered the situation. The doctor asked me to respond whenever I heard a sound, and I kept raising my hand when the sound came from my right side. At one point, the doctor stopped the test and looked at my mother. He repeated it several times because he wanted to make sure there was no mistake. I watched his face carefully, wondering what he was thinking. My mother held her hands together while waiting for his explanation. Finally, the doctor told us that he wanted additional examinations before making any conclusion. I walked out of the clinic confused. My ear was responding to sounds, but I did not understand why. My father met us outside, and when he saw my expression, he asked what the doctor had said. I told him that more tests were needed. He nodded quietly. Then, as we walked home through the busy streets, I noticed something that made me stop. A man standing across the road was speaking, and I could hear him clearly from my right side, even though he was several meters away. I turned toward my father with tears in my eyes. He looked at me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. We both knew that whatever had happened during the night had left us with more questions than answers. But neither of us knew that the next test would uncover something even more unexpected, something that would force my father to confront the meaning of the message I believed I had received. The next appointment was 3 days later, and by then I had become nervous about every sound I heard. I kept testing myself without telling anyone. I would stand in the kitchen and listen for my mother moving plates on my right side. I would close my eyes while my sister Elif walked around me and spoke from different directions. Each time I could hear her. It felt wonderful, but it also frightened me because I remembered how suddenly the change had happened. My father noticed that I was constantly touching my ear, and one evening he asked me what I was thinking about. I told him I was afraid the hearing might disappear again. He became quiet and told me that fear could make a person forget to be thankful for what was happening in the present. Then he reminded me that we should not build our faith on signs alone. His words stayed with me as we returned to the clinic in Konya. The specialist repeated several examinations and compared the results with my earlier records. I sat in the chair while the sounds became louder and softer, sometimes coming from the left and sometimes from the right. Every time I heard something, I pressed the button in my hand. When the test ended, the doctor looked at the results for a long time. He called another specialist into the room, and they spoke quietly while my parents waited. I watched them from the corner of my eye and wondered whether they had found something serious. Finally, the doctor explained that my right ear was responding to sound far differently from what they had expected based on my previous history. He said they wanted more examinations before drawing conclusions. My mother began to cry quietly, while my father simply placed his hand over hers. On our way out, I felt a strange mixture of happiness and confusion. I had wanted my hearing for years, but now that I could hear, I wanted to know why it had happened. That evening, something happened that made the situation even more personal. My father received a phone call from an old friend named Mustafa Kaya, a man who had known our family for many years. I was sitting nearby when my father answered. At first, I paid no attention, but then I heard my father mention my name. His voice became serious. After the call ended, he remained seated for several minutes without speaking. I asked him what Mustafa wanted, and he told me that Mustafa had heard about my hearing and wanted to visit us. The following afternoon, Mustafa arrived at our home carrying a small bag of fruit. He greeted my parents and then looked at me carefully. Instead of asking about the miracle immediately, he asked me what I had experienced that night. I told him about the hallway, the light, and the figure I believed was an angel. I explained that I had felt something being revealed to me about my father, although I still did not understand everything. Mustafa listened carefully. Then he asked whether I had heard any message that I could remember. I told him that I had not heard ordinary words, but I felt that I had been shown something about my father's hidden struggle. My father looked uncomfortable. Mustafa noticed and asked him whether there was something he had never shared with the family. For several seconds, my father said nothing. Then he admitted that months earlier, he had begun questioning whether he was truly leading his family toward the truth he claimed to know. He said the question had troubled him so deeply that he had started praying alone late at night, asking God to guide him and protect his family from deception. Hearing this made me realize why my father had looked so tired. He had been carrying a question that was bigger than my deaf ear. That night after Mustafa left, I went to my room and sat beside the window. The streets outside were quiet, and the lights from distant buildings reflected faintly against the glass. I could hear sounds from both sides now, but instead of celebrating, I kept thinking about what my father had confessed. If my experience had only been about my hearing, perhaps everything would have ended at the doctor's office. But the message I believed I had received seemed connected to something much deeper. I opened the small Bible that someone had once given me and began reading quietly, even though I had not yet understood what it meant for my life. I had heard about Jesus before, but mostly through conversations at school and from people in our neighborhood. That night, I was not looking for an argument with anyone. I simply wanted answers. I wanted to understand why my ear had opened, why I had seen that mysterious figure, and why my father's private struggle seemed connected to everything. As I read, I felt the same strange peace I had felt in the hallway. Then I heard footsteps approaching my bedroom. I quickly closed the book. My father stood at the doorway, and for a moment he did not speak. His eyes moved from me to the book in my hands. He asked me where I had gotten it. I told him the truth. He walked into the room, sat beside me, and looked at the cover for a long time. Then he said something that made my heart begin beating faster. He had seen that same book before, many years earlier. And the person who had given it to him had left behind a message that he had never understood. Now, after what happened to me, he wondered whether that forgotten message was connected to the strange event in our home. I wanted him to explain immediately, but he told me we would talk about it the next morning. I barely slept that night because I knew that when morning came, my father's old secret might finally be revealed. The next morning, I woke before everyone else. I had barely slept because my father's words kept returning to my mind. He had said that someone had given him the same book many years earlier and had left behind a message he never understood. When he finally came into the kitchen, I could see that he had been awake for a long time too. My mother prepared tea while my sister sat quietly at the table, and for several minutes nobody mentioned what had happened the previous night. Then my father asked me to follow him upstairs. We entered a small storage room where old books, papers, photographs, and boxes had been kept for years. Dust covered almost everything. My father opened a wooden chest and searched through several old documents until he found a thin envelope. He held it in his hand without opening it. He explained that when he was a young man, before he became an imam, he had met an elderly Christian man named Samuel Arslan near Istanbul. Samuel had treated him kindly during a difficult period in his life and had given him a Bible. My father said he had accepted the book but never read it seriously. He had kept it because he respected the man who gave it to him, but eventually the Bible was placed in the chest and forgotten. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note from Samuel. My father opened it carefully, and as he read, his expression changed. He did not read the message aloud to me. Instead, he explained that Samuel had encouraged him to seek God sincerely, to study the scriptures for himself, and never to reject something simply because he was afraid of what it might mean. My father stared at the note for a long time. Then he told me that he had remembered Samuel only after seeing me reading the Bible. He had wondered whether the strange experience I described was forcing him to examine questions he had avoided for many years. Later that afternoon, my father asked me to sit with him in the courtyard. The air was warm, and the sound of people moving through the neighborhood came from the street. He told me that he did not want me to believe something simply because of what I thought I had seen. He said that an experience could be misunderstood, and that faith should not depend on fear, excitement, or rumors. Then he asked me what I believed had happened to my ear. I told him honestly that I did not know. I only knew that I had lived for 12 years without hearing properly through my right ear, and suddenly I could hear sounds from that side. I also told him that the figure in the hallway had left me with a deep sense that I needed to seek God more seriously. My father nodded. He said he understood, but he also warned me that we needed wisdom. That conversation became one of the most important conversations of my childhood. I realized that my father was not simply trying to explain my experience. He was struggling with his own questions. He had spent years teaching other people about faith, yet now he was being forced to examine his own heart. That evening, he began reading the Bible again. I watched him turn the pages slowly, stopping whenever something caught his attention. Sometimes he would underline a passage. Sometimes he would close the book and remain silent. I wanted to ask what he was thinking, but I knew he needed time. Then, just before we went to sleep, he called me back into the room and told me that Samuel's note contained one more part that he had not mentioned earlier. The message had warned that one day, something connected to his family would cause him to reopen the book. My father said he had always considered that sentence mysterious, but after my hearing returned, he could no longer dismiss it. I looked at him and asked whether he thought my experience was the event Samuel had been talking about. My father did not answer. That unanswered question followed me into the night. I went to bed wondering whether the story had really begun when my ear opened, or whether something had been moving toward our family for years without any of us noticing. Around midnight, I woke again. This time there was no bright light in the hallway, there was only silence. I sat up and listened. Then I heard a soft sound from the room where my father kept the old chest. I stepped into the hallway and walked slowly toward it. The door was slightly open. I could hear pages turning inside. I thought my father was reading, so I pushed the door gently, but when I looked inside, my father was not there. The Bible was lying open on the table, and one of the old photographs from the chest was beside it. I picked up the photograph and saw my father as a young man standing beside Samuel Arslan. On the back of the photograph was a date and a short handwritten sentence. I could not understand why that sentence had been written there, but when I read it, my heart began racing. It seemed to connect Samuel, my father's forgotten questions, my sudden hearing, and the figure I had seen in the hallway. I ran to wake my father, but before I reached his bedroom, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, expecting to see him. Instead, the hallway was empty. Yet from the darkness behind me came a sound I had never heard before, and this time I was certain it was coming from my newly opened ear. I turned slowly, and my heart began beating so hard that I could feel it in my chest. Behind me stood nobody, yet I could hear a faint sound coming from the dark hallway. I could not describe it as a normal voice because it was softer than speech, almost like a message reaching my mind without passing through my ears. I felt the same peaceful presence I had felt on the first night, but this time there was no bright figure. I stood completely still, holding the old photograph in one hand. Then I sensed that I needed to return to the room where the Bible was lying open. I walked back carefully and looked at the page. I did not understand everything written there, but one passage immediately caught my attention. I felt as though I was being reminded that I should not be afraid and that I needed to seek truth with an honest heart. I began crying because I suddenly understood something about myself. For years, I had prayed mostly because I wanted my ear healed. I wanted God to give me something. But that night, for the first time, I wondered whether I had been thinking about God only because of what I wanted from Him. I knelt beside the table and prayed in the simplest way I knew. I asked God to guide me, protect my family, and help me understand what was happening. I did not ask for another miracle. I simply asked for truth. A few minutes later, my father appeared at the doorway. He looked frightened when he saw me there, but when he noticed the photograph in my hand, his expression changed. He asked where I had found it. I showed him the back, and he immediately took it from me. My father stared at the sentence written behind the photograph for a long time. Then he finally explained that Samuel had written those words shortly before they separated. He had told my father that there might come a day when someone in his family would experience something that would make him question everything he thought he understood about God. My father had forgotten those words until that night. He admitted that he had always considered Samuel's message strange, and for years he had kept the photograph without thinking about it. But now, after my hearing had suddenly changed, he could no longer ignore the connection. I asked him whether he believed an angel had appeared to me. He paused before answering. He said he could not tell me exactly what I had seen, and he did not want to pretend to know something he could not prove. But he said he believed God could use unexpected moments to lead people toward deeper questions. Then he told me that he had decided to visit Samuel. I was surprised because I thought Samuel lived far away. My father explained that Samuel had moved years earlier, but he had recently received information that Samuel was still alive and living in a small town outside Istanbul. My father wanted to find him and ask him what he had meant when he wrote the message. The next morning, my father told my mother about the plan. She was worried about traveling so suddenly, but she eventually agreed. I was allowed to go with my father, and my sister would stay with our mother. As we prepared for the journey, I felt excited and nervous. I believed we were about to discover something important, but I also wondered whether we would find Samuel at all. Before leaving, my father placed the old photograph inside his bag. He also carried the Bible. Neither of us knew that the journey would become much more difficult than we expected. We left Konya early in the morning. The streets were still quiet, and the sky was beginning to brighten as our vehicle moved toward the main road. I sat beside my father, watching buildings disappear behind us. For the first hour, neither of us spoke much. Then my father asked whether I was afraid. I told him I was not sure. I was happy that I could hear through my right ear, but I was frightened by everything connected to the experience. My father said he understood. As the journey continued, he began telling me stories about his younger years, including the time he had first met Samuel. He explained that Samuel had never pressured him, insulted him, or tried to force him to believe anything. Instead, Samuel had simply encouraged him to read the scriptures and ask honest questions. That detail surprised me because it was different from the angry arguments I had sometimes heard between people of different faiths. My father said that Samuel's kindness had remained in his memory for decades. As we traveled, I kept hearing sounds from my right side, and each time I noticed them, I felt grateful. But several hours into the journey, my father suddenly slowed the vehicle after noticing something on the road ahead. A man was standing beside the roadside, waving urgently for help. My father pulled over. The man approached the vehicle and looked directly at me. Then his face became strangely serious. He asked my father whether I was the boy whose hearing had suddenly returned. My father immediately became cautious and asked how he knew about me. The stranger did not answer directly. Instead, he looked at the Bible on the seat and told my father that he had been waiting for him. My father and I exchanged a confused look. We had never seen this man before. Then he mentioned Samuel's name, and suddenly our peaceful journey took an unexpected turn. My father did not immediately open the door. He lowered the window slightly and asked the stranger how he knew about me. The man looked around as though he was checking whether anyone else was nearby, then calmly told my father that his name was Imam'S and that he had once known Samuel Arslan. My father became even more cautious. He asked Imam where he had met Samuel, and the man's answer made my father stare at him in silence. Imam explained that Samuel had spoken about my father many times, and had once told him that a day would come when the Demir family would begin asking questions that could not be answered by arguments alone. Then Imam looked directly at me and said he had heard about a boy whose hearing had suddenly returned after a strange experience at home. I felt uncomfortable because I had never told anyone outside our family about the figure in the hallway. My father asked him who had told him about me. Imam said that Samuel had contacted him several days earlier and asked him to watch for a vehicle traveling from Konya toward Istanbul. He had been told that the people inside would be carrying an old photograph and a Bible. My father slowly reached into his bag and touched the photograph. He did not show it to Imam. Instead, he asked whether Samuel was in danger. Imam shook his head and said Samuel was alive, but he had become very weak and had been waiting for my father for years. Those words immediately changed my father's expression. He thanked Imam, but he did not invite him into the vehicle. Instead, he asked for Samuel's address. Imam wrote it on a small piece of paper and warned us that the journey ahead would take longer than expected because Samuel was no longer living where my father remembered. Before leaving, Imam looked at me once more and told me not to be afraid of what I might discover. Then he stepped away from the vehicle. My father waited until he disappeared from sight before starting the engine again. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, I asked him whether he trusted the man. My father said he did not know, but he admitted that the details Imam knew were too specific to ignore. We continued toward Istanbul, but my father was no longer relaxed. Every few minutes, he checked the paper with the address and then looked at the road ahead. I could tell that he was thinking about the past. Eventually, he told me something he had never told me before. Years earlier, when he was still a young man, he had gone through a difficult period after losing someone close to him. He had become angry, confused, and unsure about his future. During that period, he met Samuel, who treated him with patience and encouraged him to search for God sincerely. My father said Samuel had spoken to him about Jesus and had given him the Bible, but my father had been unwilling to seriously examine those teachings. He kept the book because he respected Samuel, yet he continued with his life and eventually became an imam. He married my mother, became a father, and built a respected life. But the questions Samuel had raised never completely disappeared. My father admitted that after my hearing changed, those old questions returned with greater force. He said he had spent years telling people to trust God, but now he was asking himself whether he had truly searched for God with the same honesty he expected from everyone else. I listened quietly because I had never seen my father speak so openly. Then I asked him whether he was afraid. He looked at me and admitted that he was. Not because he feared losing his position, but because he feared discovering that he had spent years avoiding a truth simply because facing it would require him to change. That sentence stayed with me for the rest of the journey. I realized that my father was not simply taking me to see an old friend. He was going to meet the part of his own past that he had left unfinished. We finally arrived near Istanbul late in the afternoon. The busy streets, tall buildings, and constant movement made me feel small after the quiet neighborhood where I had grown up. My father followed the address Mehmet had given us until the roads became narrower. Eventually, we reached a quiet residential area where old houses stood close together. We stopped outside a modest building with a small garden. My father remained inside the vehicle for several seconds, holding the steering wheel tightly. Then he looked at me and said that no matter what happened inside that house, we would remain calm and honest. We walked to the door and knocked. Nobody answered. My father knocked again. After a long pause, an elderly woman opened the door. She looked at my father carefully, then at the photograph in his hand. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. She stepped aside and quietly invited us in. I could hear my own footsteps clearly as we entered. The woman introduced herself as Miriam, Samuel's daughter. She told us that her father had been expecting us, but his condition had become worse that morning. My father asked whether we had come too late. Miriam shook her head and said that Samuel had been asking for him for several days. Then she led us down a narrow hallway toward a bedroom at the back of the house. Before opening the door, she stopped and looked at me. She said there was something I needed to know before I entered. Samuel had told her that if the boy with the hearing problem ever came to the house, she should not be surprised by what he said next. My father looked at me, and I felt a chill run through me. Miriam slowly opened the bedroom door. Inside, an elderly man was lying beneath a blanket, his eyes closed. Then, as though he had been waiting for that exact moment, Samuel opened his eyes and looked directly at me. His first words were not about my father. They were about the night I saw the light. Samuel's voice was weak, but when he looked at me, there was something in his expression that made me forget how tired he appeared. He asked whether I was Yusuf, and my father immediately stepped forward and introduced me. Samuel smiled faintly and told me that he already knew my name. I looked at my father, confused, but Samuel explained that he had heard about me through my father and through people who had kept in contact with him over the years. Then he asked me to come closer. I stood beside his bed while my father remained near the door. Samuel asked me what I had seen on the night my hearing changed. I described the hallway, the brightness, and the figure I believed was an angel. I told him about the feeling of peace and the strange way the message seemed to reach my heart. Samuel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he closed his eyes for several seconds. Then he told me that he could not prove exactly what I had seen, and that I should never build my faith only on an unusual experience. But he said the most important question was not whether I had seen an angel. The important question was what the experience had caused me to do afterward. Had I become more honest? Had I begun seeking God? Had I learned to love people instead of judging them? Those questions surprised me because I had expected him to explain the mystery. Instead, he was asking me to examine my heart. Then Samuel looked at my father and said that this was the reason he had been waiting. My father sat beside the bed and asked what he meant. Samuel explained that many years earlier, he had prayed that my father would one day seek God with an open heart, not because of pressure from another person, but because he genuinely wanted truth. He said he had never expected to see my father again, but he had continued praying. My father lowered his head, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. Samuel reached toward the small table beside his bed and picked up an old envelope. He handed it to my father and told him that it contained something he had written years earlier but never sent. My father opened it carefully. I could not read everything from where I stood, but I saw his hands trembling. Samuel explained that the letter was not a prophecy about my deaf ear or a prediction that an angel would appear. It was simply a reminder that people can spend years protecting the beliefs they inherited without ever asking whether they have personally searched the scriptures and sought God with sincerity. He told my father that he had never wanted him to follow Christianity because of friendship, emotion, or fear. He wanted him to investigate the teachings of Jesus honestly and make his own decision. My father remained silent for a long time. Then he asked Samuel why he had spoken about a future event connected to his family. Samuel smiled and said that he had never known exactly what would happen. He had only trusted that God could use circumstances to awaken questions that people had buried. My father then told Samuel about my hearing. Samuel listened carefully and said he was grateful that I could hear, but he warned my father again not to turn my experience into a spectacle. He said that if God had allowed something unusual to happen, the proper response was humility, gratitude, prayer, and a life that reflected love. Those words affected me deeply. I realized that I had been focusing so much on the mystery that I had almost forgotten the person I was becoming. Then Samuel asked me whether I wanted to understand more about Jesus. I looked at my father before answering. My father nodded slowly. I told Samuel that I wanted to understand. He smiled and asked Miriam to bring the Bible from the shelf beside the window. Miriam returned carrying an old Bible with worn pages. Samuel asked me to sit beside him while my father remained on the other side of the bed. He did not tell me to accept everything immediately. Instead, he encouraged me to read carefully and ask questions whenever something confused me. He explained that faith was not supposed to make me hate people who believed differently from me. It should make me more truthful, more forgiving, more compassionate, and more willing to serve others. While he spoke, I kept thinking about my right ear. I could hear his weak voice clearly, and for the first time I understood that hearing was not only about sound. I had spent years wanting to hear the world, but now I was beginning to think about whether I was also willing to listen. Samuel noticed my silence and asked what I was thinking. I told him I was wondering whether my hearing had changed for a reason beyond myself. He said only God could know the full purpose, but he encouraged me to use whatever ability I had to help people rather than draw attention to myself. Then something unexpected happened. Samuel suddenly became very quiet and looked toward the doorway. His expression changed, as though he had remembered something important. He asked my father whether he had brought the photograph. My father showed it to him. Samuel held it close to his eyes and began to cry. He said there was one detail about that photograph that my father had never known, and it was connected to the night I saw the light. My father leaned forward immediately. I watched Samuel's hands tremble as he turned the photograph over. Then he pointed to the sentence written on the back and explained that my father had misunderstood its meaning for years. What he revealed next would force my father to reconsider an event from his own youth that he had almost completely forgotten. Samuel held the photograph carefully and told my father that the sentence on the back was not written as a prediction of some future miracle. It was connected to an evening many years earlier, when my father had been a young man searching for direction. Samuel explained that he had once taken my father to a small Christian gathering outside Istanbul, where my father had listened to people speak about Jesus with a sincerity he had never experienced before. My father had left that meeting troubled, not because anyone had forced him to agree, but because some of the questions he heard had stayed in his mind. That same night, according to Samuel, my father had told him that he wanted to understand why Christians believed Jesus was more than a teacher. Samuel had encouraged him to read the gospel for himself, but before my father could continue that search, circumstances changed. He returned home, began following another path, and eventually became an imam. Samuel said the sentence behind the photograph was simply a reminder that my father's questions had never truly disappeared. My father listened with tears in his eyes. Then he admitted that he remembered that night differently. He had remembered feeling confused and afraid, but he had forgotten how deeply the conversation had affected him. Samuel looked at me and explained that my experience should not be treated as proof that one group of people was better than another. He said the lesson was about seeking God sincerely and refusing to let fear prevent honest questions. I listened carefully because I could see that my father was no longer defending an argument. He was examining his own heart. Then Samuel asked me to tell him exactly what I had felt when I saw the figure in our hallway. I described the peace, the fear, and the sense that I was being encouraged to seek God. Samuel nodded and told me that spiritual experiences can be difficult to understand, so I should never claim certainty about things I could not prove. He said the safest response was to compare everything with Scripture, pray for wisdom, remain humble, and look at the fruit it produced in my life. Those words made sense to me. Before that night, I had thought the most important part of my story was that my deaf ear had opened. Now I was beginning to understand that perhaps the greater change was happening inside my heart. My father asked Samuel whether he believed God had healed me. Samuel answered carefully. He said he was thankful that I could hear, but he did not want to make a claim beyond what we knew. The doctors had documented a change, but the reason for that change was something we could not fully explain. Samuel said that instead of arguing over the explanation, we should respond with gratitude and use the experience to become kinder people. My father lowered his head and began to pray quietly. I watched him and something inside me changed. I realized that the father I had always known as a strong religious leader was also a man who could become confused, afraid, and humbled. For years, I had believed adults always knew the answers. That day, I learned that sometimes faith begins when a person honestly admits that he does not know everything. Before we left Samuel's room, he called my father closer and gave him the old Bible that had been kept in the house for many years. He told my father that the book no longer belonged hidden inside a wooden chest. He encouraged him to read it carefully, especially the teachings of Jesus, and to allow the truth to challenge his assumptions, rather than simply searching for passages that supported what he already believed. My father accepted the Bible with both hands. Then Samuel looked at me and told me that my hearing was a gift I should never take for granted, but he also reminded me that there was another kind of hearing that mattered even more. Listening to God, listening to people who were hurting, and listening before judging. I promised him I would remember that. We prepared to leave, but as my father reached the doorway, Samuel suddenly called him back. His voice had become weaker. He told my father that the journey would not end in that house. He believed my father would soon face a difficult decision, and the decision would affect our entire family. My father asked what he meant, but Samuel did not explain. He only encouraged him to remain truthful, patient, and prayerful. As we stepped outside, I looked back through the doorway and saw Samuel watching us. I felt a strange sadness because I knew I might never see him again. During the drive away from the house, my father remained silent. The Bible lay between us on the seat. I asked him what he was thinking, but he simply said that he had spent many years telling people to seek God while avoiding some of his own deepest questions. Then his phone rang. He answered, listened for a few seconds, and suddenly pulled the vehicle to the side of the road. His face became pale. Someone from our neighborhood was calling to tell him that a serious problem had developed at our mosque, and several people were already asking for him. My father looked at me and said that we needed to return to Konya immediately. My father drove for hours with almost no conversation. I could see the worry on his face, but whenever I asked what had happened at the mosque, he told me that he needed to hear the full story before making any judgment. When we finally returned to Konya, the streets around our neighborhood were unusually busy. Several people were gathered near the mosque, speaking in low voices. My mother was waiting outside our home, and the moment she saw us, she hurried toward the vehicle. She told my father that rumors had spread after people discovered that he had traveled to Istanbul to visit Samuel. Some people had heard that he was studying the Bible, and others had begun questioning whether he was still committed to his role as an imam. My father looked deeply hurt. He had spent years serving the community, and suddenly people were judging him based on rumors rather than a conversation. I stood beside him and remembered Samuel's warning about the difficult decision. My father could either hide everything, pretend nothing had changed, and protect his position, or he could admit that he was searching for answers and accept whatever consequences followed. That evening, several community leaders came to our home. They asked my father whether the rumors were true. My father did not become angry. He simply told them that he had traveled to meet an old friend, that he had received a Bible, and that he was studying it because he wanted to understand the teachings of Jesus more deeply. The room became completely silent. One man asked whether my father had abandoned his faith. My father answered that he would never lie about what was happening inside his heart. He said he was searching for truth and that he believed honest questions should not be answered with fear. I watched the people around the room react, and I realized that my father's journey was no longer private. Whatever happened next would affect our family, his position, and the people who trusted him. That night was one of the hardest nights I had ever experienced. My mother was worried about what might happen to our family. She asked my father whether we might have to leave our neighborhood. My father told her that he did not know. I sat quietly nearby, listening to every word. Then my mother turned toward me and asked whether I regretted telling my father about the figure I had seen. I immediately said no, but inside I felt guilty because I wondered whether my experience had caused all these problems. My father heard me and came over. He told me that I was not responsible for his decisions. He said that adults must take responsibility for the choices they make, and I should never carry a burden that did not belong to me. Then he asked me to remember something important. No matter what happened, our family needed to love people rather than fight with them. The next morning, my father returned to the mosque. I stayed outside with my mother, but I could hear voices inside. People were asking difficult questions. Some were angry, some were confused, others simply wanted to understand. After several hours, my father came out. He looked exhausted, but there was peace on his face. He told us that he had decided to step away from his position temporarily so he could study, pray, and examine his beliefs without pretending. He did not know what the future would hold. He only knew that he could not continue teaching others while refusing to face the questions growing inside him. That decision cost him relationships. Some people stopped speaking to him. Others accused him of betrayal, but a few people quietly told him that they respected his honesty. I watched all of this unfold, and my understanding of faith began to change. I had once thought faith was about having every answer. Now I was learning that faith could also involve humility, courage, patience, and the willingness to seek truth even when the journey was difficult. Several weeks passed and my hearing remained normal. We returned to the specialist for another examination, and the doctor confirmed that I was still responding to sounds through my right ear. He could not give us a simple explanation for the sudden change. My father thanked him and told him that whatever the medical explanation might eventually be, our family was grateful. At home, my father continued reading the Bible. I read with him sometimes. We asked questions, compared passages, prayed, and talked about the teachings of Jesus. I did not understand everything, but I noticed that my father was changing. He became slower to judge people and more willing to listen. He began helping neighbors who had avoided him because of the rumors. One afternoon, a man who had spoken against my father came to our home. I expected an argument, but my father welcomed him, offered him tea, and listened while the man explained why he was angry. Before the man left, my father told him that disagreement did not have to become hatred. I watched from the doorway and remembered what Samuel had told me about hearing. Perhaps my right ear had opened suddenly, but learning to listen was taking much longer. Then one evening we received a letter from Miriam. Samuel had died peacefully. My father read the letter silently, and tears ran down his face. The letter contained a final message encouraging our family to remain faithful to God, love people, pray, and continue studying Scripture. My father handed the letter to me, and I read it slowly. I felt sadness, but I also felt grateful. Samuel had entered our story as an old friend from my father's past, yet his influence had changed the direction of our family. As I placed the letter beside the Bible, I realized that the greatest question was no longer why my ear had opened. The greater question was what I would do with the life I had been given. Years have passed since that night, but I still remember standing in that dark hallway and hearing sound through the ear that had been silent for most of my childhood. I remember the light, the peace, the fear, and the figure I believed was an angel. I also remember my father's journey after that experience. His life did not suddenly become easy. He lost friendships, faced painful questions, and had to rebuild parts of his life, but he became more honest about his relationship with God. He continued studying the Bible and learning about Jesus, and our family learned that following God was not about pretending to understand everything. It was about seeking truth with humility and allowing God to change the heart. My own hearing remained something I was deeply grateful for, but over time I realized that the greatest miracle was not simply being able to hear sounds through my right ear. The greater miracle was learning to listen with my heart. I began noticing people who were lonely, children who were mocked, and families who were carrying problems nobody could see. I remembered how painful it had been when other children laughed at me because of my hearing, so I became more careful with my words. I discovered that a person can have perfect hearing and still refuse to listen to someone who is hurting. I did not want to become that kind of person. My father taught me that day after day through his actions. He told me that faith in Jesus should produce love, patience, forgiveness, honesty, and compassion. He reminded me that Christians should not spend their lives attacking people who believe differently from them. Instead, we should live in a way that shows the character of Christ. We should pray for our families, pray for those who oppose us, help people who are struggling, forgive when we are hurt, and remain humble when something wonderful happens. My father never wanted me to use my testimony to make myself important. He told me that if God had allowed my story to encourage someone, then I should point people toward God rather than toward myself. That lesson has remained with me. I still do not claim to understand everything about the night I saw the light. I cannot prove every detail of what happened, and I do not want to invent an explanation simply because people want one. What I know is that my hearing changed, my family was shaken, my father began searching more deeply, and our lives were changed by questions we could no longer ignore. Samuel's final lesson also remains with me. Seek God sincerely, study His Word carefully, pray for wisdom, and never allow fear to stop you from searching for truth. The experience taught me that a miracle can change a moment, but a changed heart can transform an entire life. So if you are listening to my testimony today and you are going through a difficult season, I want you to remember that your present struggle does not have to become the end of your story. Keep praying, keep seeking God, keep studying His Word. Do not allow disappointment to make you bitter, and do not allow fear to make you stop trusting Him. If you are a believer, take your Christian journey seriously. Love one another, forgive one another, help those who are weak, pray for those who are hurting. Study Scripture instead of depending only on what somebody else tells you, and when God gives you an answer, remain humble. I began this journey wanting God to open my ear, but along the way I discovered that I also needed Him to open my heart. That is the part of my testimony I will never forget. Perhaps you have been waiting for a miracle, an answer, or a breakthrough, and perhaps you are wondering why God has not moved yet. I cannot tell you exactly when your situation will change, but I can encourage you not to stop seeking Him. Let your faith grow through prayer, obedience, love, and the study of His Word. And if this testimony touched your heart, share what lesson you learned from it and tell us where you are watching from. Most importantly, remember this: never stop seeking God, never stop loving people, and never stop praying. Sometimes the greatest change begins when we finally become willing to listen.